All right, so let's take a look at the process of actually unfolding UVs in Maya. For this, we're going to follow 3 steps, and it's going to be the same if we're doing a simple object. It's going to be the same if we're doing a very complex object. The first step is going to be reset the UVs. So let's go ahead and start with something, just a basic object here. So I'll just create a cylinder. All right, and I'll just fit or frame that, just F, and then I'm going to go ahead and go back to Save Layouts and Perspective and UV Editor. All right, so by default, you can see that the UVs for a cylinder are basically correct. This just needs to be unfolded. But just to go through the whole process, we're going to go ahead and just reset these UVs completely. All right, so let's take a look at it. The process is create, or basically frame the object in a way that it's easy to tell what's what. So for instance, this right here, if I did a camera-based projection, which is the method that I use for almost everything, I just do a camera-based projection, then you can see over here in the UVs, you can make out the top, the bottom, and the sides. Whereas if you were to get this thing, really square from the side like this, and create a camera-based projection, it's just a little harder to read, what's going on the top there. So typically I'll just put it at an angle where it makes it easy to read what that shape is, just in case I need to make some cuts or confirm some cuts in the UV editor. So you have to be at object level and then just create and then camera-based. All right, so that resets the UVs, so you can see that all the seams that did exist on this object are now gone. So we basically have erased all seams, and now it's just however the geometry is, that's what it looks like over here in the UV space. All right, the second step is cut seams where you want them to be. For this, the best tool, the sort of most intuitive tool for most people, is going to be UV 3D Cut and Sew UV tool. All right, so grab that guy. And basically the way this works is you just double click wherever you want it to add a seam. And right now my symmetry's on. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. Just double click. That's it. So you can see that that made an edge loop selection and automatically cut those UVs. So now the top will pull off the cylinder easily. Double click the one edge on the bottom, and now the bottom is ready to be removed. And now you can see here that basically this is one contiguous piece, right? All the way around here. And so there's no way to lay that flat without putting a cut somewhere. If you put a cut here, then this can unfold this way, this can unfold this way. It doesn't really matter. The one thing that you need to think about is what's the front of this thing. If this is a bottle, say for instance, we don't want to put a seam right across the middle of the front. You want to put it someplace where it's less obvious. In this case, just I'll randomly choose this one and I'll just click that, and now that's cut. Okay, so that should be pretty much ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and press F8 just to get us back to object mode. You can also right click and choose object mode. And then from there, we're just going to run unfold. So this is the third step. First step, reset UVs. Second step, cut UVs or cut seams where they need to be in order to unfold. And I didn't really explain that well on this one, but I'll do it on the next one. And then step 3 is actually unfold. So unfold here, go to the options. Unfold 3D is going to be the method that you're going to use for probably 90+% of the objects that you unfold. Occasionally, if you're only unfolding in a single direction, you need to really retain tight control over something. The legacy mode with a constraint can do a better job. For most objects, Unfold 3D is going to be the method to use. So just click Apply and Close. That'll unfold that, and you can see that now we have undistorted checkers throughout this thing. Now it's not really in a final layout, but I'm not going to worry about that for now. You can actually see there's some resolution difference. See that one of these faces here, and you can see which one it is. So the bottom face is larger, and then the top faces are smaller, which means those checkers are going to end up being larger. And that means there's a resolution difference. We can deal with that later. It's not really super important. I would say I'll just go ahead and show it since I mentioned it. When you run a layout on this, so just modify layout, this will put all of those shells into the 0 to 1 space. And some basic settings, I'll go ahead and reset this. Some basic settings you'll want to do here, you want to set a shell pre-rotation so that it aligns to the pixel grid, so either horizontal or vertical. It doesn't really matter. In this case, that means the long side will be aligned horizontally. If I set it to vertical, it's just going to flip that on end. So it doesn't really matter as long as it's aligned. Shell pre-scaling, preserve 3D ratios, means it's going to look at how much area this has in the 3D space, and it's going to make sure this has comparable area over here relative to these other shells. That's the basic thing that we want to do. I would also recommend, if we go to 2048 here, shell padding of 16 and tile padding of 8, that means between each shell it's going to leave 16 pixels. So between this one and that one it'll pack it, but it'll leave 16 pixels between them. And that'll be for MIP mapping and that sort of thing. I'll talk about that stuff later. And then 8 pixels around the tile, and the tile is the 0 to 1 space like this, and that is going to repeat, of course, over here and down to here, so that texture is just repeated, and that means if it has 8 pixels here and there are 8 pixels here, that gives you a total of 16 pixels around the edges as well. Alright, so those are the basic settings. Go ahead and click Layout. That'll pack everything into the 0 to 1 space. Everything will be matched up in resolution because we had that match to 3D space for the scale, and that's pretty much it. So this would be an all set object. Okay, so let's take a look at another object for this. And let's go ahead and jump to something more interesting looking than just a basic primitive. If you go to Windows, General Editor's Content Browser, in here we can find lots of stuff. So in the Examples tab, go to Modeling and then Clothing here. So we'll just do some long pants here. You can either middle click and drag this in or just double click it and that will import it. You can see here it shows up in my outliner. So I'll just zoom out until I can see that. And you can see that with this, these already have good UVs as well. But just like we did with the cylinder, we're going to go ahead and reset this just using the standard method because, you know, when you model things yourself, you're typically just not going to have a good starting point for UVs, and resetting UVs is typically the best way to do this. So let's go ahead and do that as part of this example as well. So you can see that these pants, they only have an inseam, right? There's only a cut here, and there's a cut around the butt crack here and it meets at the inseam, but there's no outseam. And you know, most of the time there's an outside seam on pants as well. Not always, but most of the time. And say going back to this original example here, this shows 4 pieces of fabric that are put together, which is very common for pants. You can see the back here, the front here, and so we're just going to lay it out just like this, just to sort of bring this whole thing full circle. So let's take a look here. First thing we're going to do, frame this up in a way that it's easy to tell what's what. The second step of the first step, I guess, is create a camera-based projection, and that just resets all of those UVs. Now, one thing that you do need to watch out for is if you have something selected, let's say for instance I'm in edge mode here, and I go to create a camera-based selection, it's not going to do anything. See, it gives me a warning down here saying that you didn't have anything selected. You can do this at a face level, but in the beginning like this, I recommend just go ahead and do it at the object level. We're trying to reset all those seams anyways. Okay, so there we go. That gives us our reset UVs. And now we want to go through and add seams onto this thing wherever it makes the most sense. Now in this case, you want to add seams where there are seams in the real world. We already know that we're trying to match this right here, and so that means there's a seam down the outside of the leg, a seam down the inside of the leg, and then through the crotch. So let's go ahead and just match that up. So for that, typically what I would recommend is go back to object mode, and this prevents you from starting out in face mode with the 3D cut and sew tool. It's fine if it starts like that. You can just go to edge mode, but typically I'll go to object mode and then switch to this tool, and then I'll just double click on that out seam right there, and then I'll continue that. You need to make sure that your edges, when you're cutting them like this, go all the way through the ends of the object. So you can see here, this is a border edge. So now that edge loop goes all the way through from this border edge to this border edge, and that's a clean cut. We'll go ahead and do it the same on this side. If you had symmetry, you could be using that. Looks like that's not quite symmetrical with what I did on the other side. There we go. The inseam, same thing. So we just want to add a seam here. So just double click, and that adds the seam all the way through the mesh. And then we'll need to grab the butt crack and do that. And what that's going to do is it's going to stop at this seam, and then we'll just need to continue that one around. So in the end, what you have is a cut down the outside, a cut down the inside, and then cut around the crotch. All right, so typically I'll go back to object mode before I run my unfold as well. and then modify unfold. We'll talk about shortcuts to these things later, but I'm just going to leave it. The default should be fine. So you can see that basically did a good job. All the UVs look nice and square. The layout is a complete mess here, but let's go ahead and just run a layout. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my shell pre-rotation as vertical. That means it'll try to keep these things oriented where the legs are running vertically. So that did a pretty good job. If I look back at this, I can see the back is on this side, the front is on the left side. So I'm going to go ahead and just make that arrangement the same. You see this one got flipped around. You use your standard transformation tools to do this. That's it. Okay, so that basically gives us what we wanted here. So I'll just kind of slide those guys back over. There are lots of different ways that you can do this. In this particular case, I would tend to just scale this down until it fit into the 0 to 1 space. If you're looking for more precision or to truly maximize, oops, looks like I left one UV left behind there. So if you just double click, and in this case I'm holding shift down, it'll grab all those. There we go. So now that all fits into the space here. But if you were really trying to maximize space or do this quickly, in here there's a normalize. So under normalize, I want to normalize along U and V. I want to make sure that I do it collectively. And then you want to make sure you preserve aspect ratio. So this is much like you'll find this aspect ratio in multiple places with UVs. And what that means is, do you want to maximize it to fill the space and just let it distort, or keep the aspect ratio, which means it won't stretch the thing and just fit it to where it stops? And that's what I want in this case. So you can see that expands right up. Now the one thing this does though is it goes right up to that edge. So typically I don't like that anyway, so I'll just pull that down very slightly so that we have a little bit of padding around that edge. That's it. So that would give us the UVs we need for the pants here. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a good sense of the process. I'm going to do one more just to give you another example. And for this, we'll just start with maybe just a sphere. Okay, so because a sphere is something that it just doesn't have a very clean way to lay out. You know, there's not a perfect way to lay out a sphere without a bunch of seams where it's not distorted. So this is called a sawtooth pole. This is the default, and you can see that you end up with a lot of seams around the top, and you can see that creates that kind of sawtooth pattern. And this is a maximized layout. I mean, it really is using the full 0 to 1 space, but you can see how much distortion there is, and pretty much every part of this thing is distorted. So let's take a look at a couple of options. So first step, reset your UVs. All right, so I'll go ahead and come in here, create camera-based projection. All right, just straight up reset those things. Next step, use the 3D Cut and Sew UV tool and add seams into this thing. Now, how do you know where to add seams? This is something that comes with experience and time, but there are several different ways to sort of think about it and analyze it. So for the cylinder, there was the top and the bottom, and it was very clear that those pieces could be separated off and make a non-distorted UV layout. With the pants, you know, real world pants have seams, and so we just followed that seam pattern, and that worked. For a ball or a sphere like this, it's a little less clear, and so there are, you know, lots of different ways that you can do this. One way that you could think about it is, if you were going to wrap this thing, how could you take a piece of paper and, you know, put it on the top here and wrap it around this, and, you know, you could be pushing it down here. By the time you got here, you're going to create a wrinkle kind of right along here. You'd have kind of a wrinkle going there, and that's an indication that would create some distortion, and so you might have to cut a relief slit up like this. Now luckily, UVs aren't quite as rigid and inflexible as paper or wrapping paper, so it's more sort of like spandex, and so it's got some give to it, and you can be a little more flexible with exactly how you draw those lines. So generally what I would recommend, if you have an object that doesn't have sort of prescribed seams, like there's a seam in a real world object, or there's a different material at a different location, then generally treat everything like a cylinder. It just makes it easier to figure out how to separate these things. So typically what I would do for an object like this is I would just pick a seam arbitrarily somewhere down this, maybe a third of the way or so, and just double click it. Do the same from the bottom, double click that. Looks like I was not very even. One thing you can do, this is a good thing to go ahead and talk about, is you can hold Control and double click and that'll just seam that right back up. So if I decided I wanted this one, I can move it down a ring and then this one. All right, so that is still off. my aim is awful. All right, so let's just say that's close enough. All right, and I could always check this from the top. So I just switch to the top view and now I can see like I've got the same ring top and bottom. So basically I'm all set there, and I'll switch back to the perspective. Now I'm using shortcuts for this stuff, and I'm holding down the space bar, and then I'm using this as my shortcut. So this is just left mouse click, and then this is a marking menu that pops up that allows me to quickly change views. It doesn't really matter. That's not very important. Just however you know to navigate is perfectly fine. You can come over here and click this, and then spacebar here, spacebar to come out, spacebar back to here. It doesn't really matter. Whatever you're used to is perfectly fine. But I am going to go ahead and bring my UV editor back. Okay, and then just like with the cylinder, now what we have is one contiguous strip here, right? And there's no way to unfold this thing. Think of this as like a wristband, right? There's no way to take a wristband and lay it out perfectly flat unless you cut the thing in half. And so that's what we need to do. It's just somewhere on this thing we cut it in half. This is the front, because I'm looking down the Z right here. So Z is typically going to be the front of your object. So maybe I want to do the back or maybe the side or something like that. It's pretty arbitrary in this particular case. Double click and it will add that seam. Notice that it's smart enough to recognize that's a border edge and that's a border edge, so don't keep making that selection. If you did this with another tool set, just the regular select tool for instance, it would select all the way around. Alright, so that's pretty much it. That should give us a decent starting point. Again, I would press F8, and that's going to bring me up to the object level, and then modify, unfold. Unfold 3D again is going to do a good job on this. Everything looks pretty good. You can see that the UVs themselves are actually pretty clean. There's a little distortion in them, but it's a balance with something like a sphere. You're trying to figure out how much distortion are you willing to take versus how many seams are you willing to have. So of course you could blow this thing into every single face is its own island, but that's extremely inefficient. And really difficult to work with in most applications. So this is a good balance right here. So I would do the same thing on this. I'll go ahead and run layout one more time on this, and that just fits that all into the 0 to 1 space. Again, you can see the distortion on here, and it's just a balance. UVs don't typically have to be absolutely flawless. You just have to find that right balance of seam ratio to how much distortion. If I was going to try to put a geometric pattern on this thing, I'd have to be a little bit more accurate with it. If it was just going to have a bunch of scratches on it or something, then it's perfectly fine. Okay, so that gives you a pretty decent idea of how to do this. I'm going to go ahead and show you the basic steps for unfolding sort of written out here. And so this is the first step, is you just do a camera-based projection, and that just resets all of those seams, and you run that at the object level. And then you're going to cut seams wherever you need to allow that unfolding. And again, that is typically going to be done with the 3D Cut and Sew UV tool. I didn't show other tools, but there are other tools, the cut tool in the UV editor. There are a variety of different tools that you can actually use. There are interactive tools for doing this, but 3D Cut and Sew UV tool is pretty much the easiest way to do this at this point. Again, this is one of those things that, you know, if you're modeling pants have seams. Use those seams. If you're modeling a hand or a glove, you know, there are seams on gloves that you could use for the same thing for hand layout, for instance. So matching seams to where they are or where they would be on a similar object, that typically is a good way to approach where to start adding in your seams. If you have multiple materials, that's a great place to add seams too. So if you have some part of an object is wood and then there's a metal component, just creating a seam at that location tends to make it easier for texturing as well. So contiguous 3D shapes, you need to have a seam. So this is, I put on here the bottle labels, but it's very similar to what I was talking about with the the sweatband. So you just need to have some seam. So that those sweatbands, they have one seam along them. It's the same thing you're going to do. Same thing with the bottle. There's a seam on the back of it somewhere to allow it to lay out flat. And then for those objects where you don't have prescribed seam locations, just go ahead and try to imagine how would you wrap that with wrapping paper. And any place that wrapping paper would really tend to scrunch up or create large wrinkles, that's where you're going to have to add a seam. It's okay if those aren't perfect the first round. Like the nice thing about this is it's very forgiving. This is a very iterative process. So after you do that, you run unfold. If things don't look great, then just do it again. So add some more seams. So on the unfold step, Unfold 3D is the best method more than 90% of the time. One thing that you might run into is if you have an object that has a transform on it and it's got a non-uniform scale, not 111, not 222, but like 215, then that can create a lot of distortion using the unfold method. And for that, you would want to freeze that out. I'll talk about that in another video, but I just at least wanted to mention it here. Okay, so there you go, right there. That's the note that I just gave. And then legacy mode is left in Maya because it still does have a couple of places where it excels. And most of the time that comes in if you're trying to unfold something only in a single direction and really restrict the motion of the unfold, that legacy can work better for that. It's largely not going to apply to organic modeling. I would say 99% of the time, Unfold 3D is going to be what you're going to use for organic stuff. And again, this is the same note that I just gave. If when you run your unfold, it just looks too distorted in places, then just go back, add a couple more seams, do it again. Maybe go back, think about that object, try to break it down to a smaller piece and do that. That's a general good note for UVing and overall is if you have a really complex thing, break it down to smaller components. So for instance, for a human torso, I would cut the arms off at the shoulders. Deal with the arm as a separate thing because now you have a sleeve. That's very easy to do. One cut down the arm to the wrist, cut the wrist off, and then handle the hand like a glove, right? So breaking these things down into smaller components and thinking about how it would do, and not trying to keep everything as one piece tends to make it a lot easier to deal with. Okay, that's the basic process. We'll talk a lot more about UVs. I just want to make sure I covered the basics for you guys to get going on this thing.